Thanks very much, Roy, and thank you all very much indeed for coming in this afternoon and listening. Did you hear me there, being polite? You may remember your mother telling you that politeness costs nothing, or perhaps one of your teachers told you that. Sometimes in questionnaire design, that seems like a lesson that we forgot somewhere along the way, but I don't want to start digressing already. Better questionnaire design sort of implies that we're already doing it quite well, just need to be a little better, and I wonder if that is true. In my going around and teaching this as a subject, I'm usually unsurprised to find that most of my delegates have never had any formal training at all in questionnaire design. Now, however good they may be at doing what they've been told to do or shown to do, it certainly does beg the question, do we know what we are supposed to be doing? Because if we have no framework on which to build and a solid framework on which we all agree and we know why we agree, then it's hard to know if what we do is good, bad, or indifferent. So, some first principles. I always like to start at the beginning. What is market research? Now, keeping it simple, avoiding jargon, I like to think of it like this. It's about asking the right people, the right questions, and importantly, understanding their answers. If we want to put this into our own jargon and make a graphic out of it, then it would be sampling, questionnaire design, and interpretation. And like all good triangles, it needs all three to work, and the absence of any one of them causes the whole thing to fail. So, then building on first principles, we have the principles of questionnaire design. I stole this from Ian Brace's textbook on questionnaire design. This idea of satisfying multiple stakeholders. Of course, we must satisfy the needs of the client, collecting all the relevant information to answer their problem. We also have a responsibility to interviewers if we have them, making it easy for them to administer. Other internal people we might want to satisfy would include our survey programmers, our data processors. Finally, and most regularly forgotten about, are the respondents. They need a questionnaire that's not too hard, it maintains their interest, doesn't take up too much of their time, and enables them to give us their truth. If you're experienced in market research and questionnaire design, I challenge you to ask yourself this question and try to answer it honestly. I hope that you put the needs of the respondent higher than you put the needs of your internal people, but I don't think you'd be alone if you didn't. Now, in the spirit of stealing from others' work, this is from Worcester and Downham, published by SMR back in 1984. The questionnaire has to fulfill a number of functions, and we can usefully divide that into scientific and practical. On the scientific side, we need to guard against bias and error in order to provide measurements that are both reliable and valid. I'm not going to get into discussion on these now, but I would urge anyone listening who's unfamiliar with these terms, reliability and validity, to make themselves familiar with them as soon as possible. On the practical side, the questionnaire, and only the questionnaire in the case of online research, has to motivate the respondent to provide complete and accurate answers. It's supposed to be there to help them. It should communicate with them and help them work out what their answer is. All in all, it has to make their lives easy. Now, if all this sounds difficult, well, we are in luck. There are plenty of textbooks out there that can help you understand what it is that you do and help you get better at it. I'd like to start my piece now by telling you three what I would describe as inalienable facts about respondents. These are things I think we would all do well to always remember. The first is that they're ordinary people. They're not all as well educated as you and I, and not all as well versed in the world of marketing and commerce as we all are. So let's write simple, straightforward questions in plain language. Let's avoid complexity and jargon. You sometimes might find this is an uphill struggle with your clients who also speak in jargon, but it's a battle well worth fighting. And actually, while we're on the subject of respondents, let's try not to think of them as that, but as people. You'll find that you'll treat them better if you think of them as people, than subjects of some kind of experiment that you can do with what you like. Because they know that they are in an experiment. They think of you, the researcher, as a scientist who knows things, probably wears a lab coat, carries a clipboard. Since they know it's not a conversation, they think that everything they can see, read, or hear has some meaning, something that you put into it. And guess what? It does. So you have to understand the meaning of everything you put into the survey. Another byproduct of being in an experiment is that they want to look good to you and will defer to you. We could call this social desirability bias, acquiescence bias, the experimenter effect, whichever we like. So finally, about respondents, they are unreliable witnesses to their own behavior. They forget the inconsequential things that we find utterly fascinating. They post hoc, I can never say that, post hoc justify as rational purchases that they made completely emotionally on the spur of the moment or just because everybody else did. But we don't blame them for this. It's part of human nature. We all do it. Anything we can do is at least not to try to ask the unaskable. Direct questions like how much influence does advertising have on your purchase decision are unanswerable. And other formulations are too. And here's one. Let's go have a little look at that. Who thinks in elapsed time in terms of quarter hours? And a quarter of an hour is 15 minutes. 15 minutes is not an example of a quarter hour. That's the pedant in me screaming. And how many quarter hours are there in an average week? Well, I guess they're the same number of quarter hours as there are in every single week. Now, if you do happen to think in terms of quarter hours, I wonder, do you also fraction them up such that they need to be rounded? You look at that instruction at the end. You can always round up, or you can round to the closest whole number, but you can't always do both. This question will give you data, but that data will be fairly meaningless. Okay, well, that was 3 things about respondents. What about the questionnaire itself? Firstly, let's not forget it's supposed to be a conversation between you, the scientist, and the respondent, that ordinary member of the public. So let's make it a conversation, not an interrogation. We can change subjects, of course, but we should say that we're doing it. We might even take time to say something encouraging at that point, like thank you or well done. All the little pauses that you get in the questionnaire conversation are a great time to do motivational work. And it gives the respondent a mental break from thinking about questions and answers, which, believe it or not, actually is cognitively tiring. On the subject of getting tired, the respondent will answer most all of the questions you put to them, way past their own mental best interest. They don't necessarily realize that they're getting mentally tired, and their responses are tending towards satisficing. So do insert those mental breaks, or keep the whole thing to under 20 minutes. So okay, we've dealt with the respondent, the ordinary person. We've got the questionnaire structure sorted out. What about questions themselves? Well, firstly, I'd say always ask single questions, and make sure the answers are single questions too. Take a little look at this answer list and classify yourself. It's not necessarily easy, is it? I wonder how many people out there found themselves reading and rereading the answer that had all those negations in them. I'm not paying attention, I'm not taking notes, I'm not alone, so what am I? It's much easier just to keep it simple. Since it's an experiment, they know how carefully you've written all your possible answers, and they want to know what meaning does it have. So what could this possibly mean? Well, in fact, there is an assumption on the part of the respondent that this set of bandings is the normal distribution of the thing that's actually being measured, which implies, of course, that the central banding must contain the average, or the median. Most ordinary people couldn't tell you the difference anyway. And this means some respondents will answer how they think they are relative to the average. This also means that any averages you calculate from such a question will be partly dependent on the ranges you employed. So if you want to set one of these things up, the center of the bandings must contain the average, and that might well be the thing that you're trying to discover anyway, and at which point you can see what a problem it is to set up your own set of bandings. For numerical questions like this, you can always use an open question. If the person you're speaking to who's filling in the survey knows the answer, they'll generally give it to you, and you can band it up later. That's really technical. This other one's a little bit easier. We should avoid asking questions in grids. Why? Well, because they encourage behavior that we'd rather not see. For the respondent, they're tedious, they're often daunting at first view, and they can be mentally exhausting to process. Each item needs to be thought about, and often a cognition, a thought, needs to be made for every point in the grid. Imagine a grid consisting of 10 items with 8 possible multi-coded answers per item. That's 80 separate questions. Because the grid is presented as a whole thing, it's processed as such, not as individual items or individual questions. The whole thing becomes comparative. The grid itself leads to too fast mental processing, often to the point where thinking stops and heuristics takes over. And this is what gives you straight lining and other undesirable data outcomes. Here you can see the outcome of this heuristic processing of grids. In our experiment here, we had a 71-item agree-disagree grid. Right in the middle, we put a direct instruction to code answer number 2, the 31st item. You can see on the left of the graph that 17% of respondents failed to code to 2 when they were asked to do so. The majority, when you went and looked at their data, had employed a heuristic called frequency bias and coded this answer exactly the same as they'd coded the majority of answers they'd given so far in the grid. Almost all of the rest had employed a different heuristic called the recency heuristic and coded it exactly the same as they'd coded item 30. As a comparison, when the same instruction was given as the 31st separate question, agree, disagree, only 4.5% failed to do as instructed. We're humans. We're agreeable people. We'd rather agree with each other than disagree, whatever our true feelings. And this applies doubly so in the setting of a questionnaire, where you're seen as the scientist. It can be more subtle than just the response to a question that has yes or no as the given answers. It also affects people's reported attitudes. If we ask for agree or disagree on this opinion, it's viewed in part as the opinion of the scientist. 47% of this population agreed that men were emotionally more suited to politics than women. If you take the opinion out of the question and ask who is best suited to politics, then the answer you get is different. 47% versus 33% is a substantial difference. Now, talking about manipulating opinion, there's no easier way of doing this than using images. And that's because images are both powerful and they have meaning themselves. See in this example, the picture makes concrete the abstract construct that is a summer beach holiday. I might as well have used this image. It also is a summer beach holiday, but I wonder, would it give the same results? Well, it'll come as no surprise perhaps to learn that of course it doesn't. The words alone, if we just use them, tell us that about 60% of our population preferred a summer beach holiday. In fact, that lone palm and white sand picture actually is a good representation of the summer beach holiday, even if it isn't one that we don't actually experience very often. The more common experience, the crowded beach in Brighton, gets nearly half as many mentions as the preferred type, but yet the words summer beach were there all along. And they're the words that are going to end up in your client's report or tables, not the pictures. This is a clear case of manipulation on the researcher's part, resulting in very different data outcomes. Let's return for a moment to grids and scales. It's very important, if you want somebody to respond using a scale, then the item that you present them with must be scalable and not simply a dichotomy. Take this question, for example. You are sort of being asked to rate this presentation in terms of its usefulness. But in fact, you're being asked to agree or disagree whether you're personally at this particular point on the useful continuum, the point of extremely useful. It can then be considered a dichotomy. You're either at that point or you are not at that point. So, if you want to measure how useful something is, then you should make your scale the one of usefulness, not of agreement, because otherwise you're simply making hard work for the respondent. Why is it hard work? It's hard work because it's a two-step process. Firstly, you, the respondent, has to decide how useful you find the presentation, which is actually very easy to answer. And then you have to translate that into some degrees of agreement. What the researcher who writes such a question hopes is that the answers will line up like this. At the top of the scale, all is well and good, but the bottom of the scale becomes problematical. Why? Because there is no opposite of useful. The scale of useful ends with not at all useful. But that gets us into a whole other topic. You need to understand your scale, and you certainly can't mix up unipolar and bipolar scales. My time's almost up. We've only scratched the surface of questionnaire design. There's so much more we could do, so much more we could discuss. There never is enough time. What I've told you here are some of my personal favourites. We could have spent our time thinking about how different modes need different question styles, whether we should force people to answer questions, whether we should give them a don't know option or not. Should we multi-code things, or should we get a yes no for each item? The list goes on and on and on. When I was a young researcher, we didn't learn anything like enough about questionnaire design. And it's only in my current role that I've been fortunate, if you like, to have been given the time to find out more about what it was that I was doing when I was doing it for money. Education is time well spent. For me, this knowledge of how to ask questions and what the answers mean, that's what separates us in market research from others who operate in the consumer insight space. So, before I go off on another rant about that, let's summarize what I said or I tried to say. Questionnaire writing, I think, is a fascinating mix of science and art, and you need to get both parts right. Remembering that respondents are just ordinary people, you need to get the language right for the lowest common denominator. Everybody has to understand it. Don't forget you are conducting an experiment, and the respondent knows that. But this is not an excuse not to think about the conversation. Make it flow from one question to another, from one topic to another. You have to know what the answers mean, and they have to be unambiguous. Not only that, they have to be the answers to the questions that you posed. Whatever your level, whatever experience you have, you can always get better at what you do. So I'm going to finish by urging you to always be learning and always be challenging your own work.